Life in the western U.S. has now become synonymous with wildfire. Whether it's smoke or actual fires near your home or one of your favorite places maybe, we all deal with wildfires. And it's not just in the summer anymore either, it's a year-round problem. In today's episode, we talk with Brendan Witt, Western Lands Policy Fellow here at WRA, and the former host, as well as the creator of 2 Degrees Out West, so my predecessor. We're talking all about wildfire in the West, which is a major reason why Brendan switched over from multimedia storyteller to working in the Western Lands team. We talk all about what makes a wildfire and what we can all do to mitigate them and be ready for them.
Higher wildfire risk as we're in this transition as well. And so overall, no matter what time of year it is, no matter where you are, I think wildfires are a risk that people should be thinking about planning for.
Welcome to 2 Degrees Out West, a podcast from Western Resource Advocates, where we talk about all the things that we love and cherish about the Western United States, as well as the impacts of climate change and the solutions that people around the U.S. are implementing to create a better environment, one that is thriving and beautiful and resilient for years to come. I'm your host, Jessie Janessi, the multimedia storyteller here at 2 Degrees Out West and for Western Resource Advocates. Now let's get started talking to Brendan. Today on the podcast, we have Brendan Witt. He is a Western Lands Policy Fellow at WRA. Brendan works to find ways to help Western communities bolster resilience against the threat of catastrophic wildfire. In this role, he primarily supports state policy efforts to increase the use of prescribed fire and improve ecosystem restoration, encourage land use planning to reduce wildfire risk, and support funding for these and other wildfire mitigation policies. And I will say also, Brendan used to be the host of 2 Degrees Out West, and he founded the podcast. So it's pretty funny to have him on the show now. But now he's all about mitigating wildfire. So this is the perfect person to have on the podcast to kind of kick off wildfire season, which I guess doesn't sound that great, but you know, we got to talk about it. It's happening. It's out here. So what are we going to do about it? Welcome, Brendan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, Jesse, thanks for having me. Like you were saying earlier, it's a little weird to be on this side of the mic, but really great to talk to you.
Yeah, I am just going to say thank you so much for creating this, because you basically made this position for me and I really love it. So thank you.
I'm just happy it's still running. It's, it started 3 years ago now, as, maybe this might work for us thing seems to be going really well. And I think you're doing a great job as host. So it's been really fun seeing the direction you've taken things.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been so cool to just kind of like find my own path and start to develop this. So it's been rad. It's the perfect kind of intersection of creativity and conservation. I'm about it. So let's just get started by talking a little bit about how you used to be the multimedia storyteller and how you switched to a Western Lands Policy Fellow and kind of what spurred that change for you.
Yeah, I think, probably like many people, probably like many of us, I had a non-linear career path to where I am now and started in actually craft beer and brewing in Colorado. So out of undergrad, I started as a brewer and was in beer sales and eventually kind of took over marketing for the small brewery that I worked for. But I knew that I wasn't feeling really fulfilled. I wanted to work in conservation and had always spent a lot of time outdoors, was a big fly fisherman, hiker and hunter, and wanted to spend a lot of time figuring out how to take care of the things that I really cared about. And when I thought about it, conservation was where I wanted to make a turn and invest my time and energy. And so I kind of took that opportunity to take on a storytelling role with WRA, a marketing role when it started, and transferred those skills there. But then through that work, I always knew I wanted to be in conservation. I wasn't 100% sure kind of what shape that would take. And I started learning so much. Like we talked about with the podcast, you get to talk to so many cool people. And I think one of the best blessings of the multimedia storyteller role, which I'm sure you're finding too, is that you get to just learn a little bit from everybody all over the organization, interact with all of the different areas of WRA. And I learned so much from all that. But what I really learned is that I loved the work our lands team was doing. I was really interested in it and invested in it. So I started kind of diving into it more. And from that, I kind of decided it was the direction I wanted to go and went to go back to school and do the kind of night school thing. Got a master's in environmental policy and management from the University of Denver and loved every second of it and what we were working on, and kind of tried to combine that with my work as much as I could day in, day out. And then that kind of drove me more towards land use management issues and recreation issues, as well as forest health and fire issues. And then around the same time, WRA was starting up its wildfire resilience program. And I had some personal experiences with wildfires here in Colorado that really kind of changed my perspective. So I started to shift my focus more intently towards that.
Yeah, I definitely find myself being swayed by the different people I interview and being like, maybe I'll get into like mining activism. Maybe I'll get into Western land stuff. And like, yeah, it's funny because you're just like, oh, there's all these options and these things that I'm passionate about. So I feel that for sure. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit more about the fire in Colorado and how that influenced you? It's the East Troublesome Fire, right?
Yeah. So the East Troublesome was a really interesting fire personally, and then also just from kind of a fire history, fire science standpoint. I think it's the second largest fire now by acreage burned, and then in terms of destruction, it might be the third, because we had a fire I'll probably talk about later that burned through a suburban neighborhood in December 2021, and of course caused much more damage. East Troublesome Fire was by all means a kind of normal fire for most of its time ignited, a large but kind of typical fire for what we see in Colorado these days. It was actually in an area that I had backpacked in on my birthday that year, where it kind of started off, and it spent the fall hunting in and around, and wasn't really a huge fire for concern until the night of October 21st. And we started getting these incredible, people call them Chinook winds or hurricane force winds in Colorado. And the forecast really changed. The fire behavior and the predictions and modeling for the fire behavior went from, something that is a large fire that people would pay attention to, but not something that would evacuate the largest towns in the area, to an unpredictably catastrophic blaze, and just the kind of what I think of as the true embodiment of the phrase inferno. As those winds hit the fire, which I think was at like 19,000 acres at that point, might have been a little bit larger. It blew up overnight and eventually ended up burning 100,000 acres, 109,000 acres, I think, in total, covering miles of land and jumping the Continental Divide, which I believe it's the first fire to have ever done that, to send embers up and over the Continental Divide at 12,000 feet and then spark what's called a spot fire, or a new fire out ahead of it on the other side of the continent. We talk about the Continental Divide as where water is flowing one way on one side out to the Pacific Ocean and out to the Atlantic on the other. We're talking about the crown of the continent. And this fire was big enough and devastating enough to throw embers that could start fires all the way across those mountains and into another community in Estes Park. And I spent a lot of time, a lot of my life in a small town that was kind of right in the path of that fire, called Grand Lake, Colorado, and consider it a second home. And that night, we started getting texts from friends and family who were up there. I was down in Denver at the time, and they were packing up and evacuating as fast as they could. And I was thinking to myself, what is this 19,000 acre fire? How is this going to happen? And I knew, because I had spent a lot of time hunting and hiking and fishing in the area between where the fire was that night and where it would ultimately end up, that everything was very dry, densely packed with beetle-kill, and kind of the perfect fuel for a fire like this. But it still didn't make sense in my mind. And even, one of my best friends is a smoke jumper, or an airplane deployed wildland firefighter, kind of the Navy SEALs of wildland firefighting. And I was talking to him that night, and I was like, hey, do you think there's any chance that this gets to town? And he said it's going to be a pretty consequential 2 or 3 next days. And then I woke up early the next morning before sunrise and went out, was doing some field research for my master's at the time, and checked my phone. And if people are familiar with wildfire, check the website called InsaWeb that updates maps of fire boundaries, and saw that not only had that area already been covered, but that it was knocking on the door of the town that I consider a second home in Grand Lake. So I was extremely thankful that the town and fire officials knew to evacuate, but we had never really seen a fire like that before. So I spent the next 3 days just totally wrapped in trying to understand what had happened, what was happening. I had the emergency scanner on, listening to all the different firefighters, even when I was sleeping at night. And it really shifted my focus after that to think about what happened, why did it happen the way that it did, why was this so different from any wildfire that we had seen in recent history, what were the impacts going to be like, and really it changed where I wanted to go and where I wanted to work, having seen a community that I cared about so much be impacted so greatly by this massive, unpredictable, unprecedented fire. And it has really been kind of, I think, the foundation for me in this role as a policy fellow, looking at how to increase community resilience against these kind of Western mega fires that we're seeing, these massive fires driven by climate change that are becoming a year in, year round reality for Western communities. Everybody's experiences. I'm sure you experienced wildfires where you are as well. And anybody listening to this podcast has probably had some kind of similar personal experience with wildfires at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I just went to Frenchman Lake, which is like my favorite spot to go with the kids and just sit by the lake and camp, get on the water. And it had a huge fire 2 years ago, and I haven't been up there since. I just didn't get up there last year. And so much of the campgrounds and everything is just stacks and stacks of, burnt trees that the Forestry Service is just like putting into these humongous piles to start clearing them out, because they're obviously like a hazard, that can fall over into the campground and all that stuff. So it was crazy to be up there for the first time since that fire. And I know it's not the only lake, like Lake Davis, like so many spots that we go and recreate at are like that now. And then we get fires down here in Reno all the time too. So
yeah, I think, almost anybody who's listening to this podcast who lives in the Western United States is within driving distance from a burn scar like this, or has maybe not quite to the degree of the East Troublesome, or, we had 2 or 3 massive fires that year, the East Troublesome, the Cameron Peak, and I think the Grizzly and the Pine Gulch fires were all some of Colorado's biggest in history, all in one year. So it was a massive fire year for us. But people are anybody listening to this is so close. I feel like I kind of realized in the wake of that, this is going to be the front line for Western communities for how they confront climate change. Wildfire impacts and wildfire resilience is kind of in the front of everybody's mind, especially, you think of this time of year, we like to say that fire season isn't a thing anymore because wildfire really is a year-round risk. That fire we were talking about took off in October, which would historically have probably been considered at the very end or out of Colorado's wildfire season, and just seen time over and time again in Colorado that it's a year-round risk now. As things get hotter in the summer, I think it starts to be right in front of everybody's mind. And this is just such a tangible way that we all interact with the impacts of climate change now.
Yeah. And not even getting into the whole impact of the smoke, right? Like when I did my podcast with Jim Marion about our air quality, and asthma and all of that stuff, environmental equity with that, the smoke is like such a big problem for us. We have smoke days now where my kids have to stay home from school because it's not safe, and we don't have air purifiers in our house. My son has asthma and it gets super smoky in here. And we just like buy basically those furnace filters and we put them on box fans, and like we put like a bunch of them in our home and we just run them all the time and change them out. We have to change them out like every day or 2 days because they just get so full of all the smoke that's in the air and stuff, all the particles. So yeah, I mean, I think even if you're not in a place where you're close enough to see the fire, right, you see the impacts of the fire in the air for sure.
Yeah, it's a great point too, because it's a good reminder. I mean, right now here in Denver, we are currently and have been enveloped in the smoke from the wildfires in Alberta, Canada, for the past 2 weeks. We have some of the nation's worst air quality. It's unhealthy to be outside, especially for sensitive groups. And it's a national issue too, because I remember when the East Troublesome and the Cameron Peak were burning, my sisters who live across the country on the East Coast were getting our smoke 2 or 3 days later. So even, it's a great point. It's not just a regional or a local problem, although we can really relate to it here in the West as a regional and local impact. It really does impact the whole country.
Yeah, it's crazy that you guys are getting that fire smoke from Canada. But yeah, I mean, that's where we're at now,
I know, it's wild. I actually, in a previous life, I was a bartender and a fishing guide in Alaska and drove from where the fires are now back to Colorado to start my job as a multimedia storyteller. And I'm just thinking about how far that is from us and how the smoke is just making its way down here is, like you said, absolutely crazy to say. I think it took me 4 days to get from where the fires are going right now to Colorado.
Yeah, it's kind of this like sad but important lesson about the interconnectedness, right? Like all the time I'm like, oh, well, at least we're not in a flood zone on the East Coast, like, even though so many of my friends and family are, and I love them and I don't want that to happen, but like, we don't have to worry. Just thoughts like that. But like, all of that is not true. Like, the impacts of climate change, wherever they are going to have ripple effects, right? So,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well said.
I was just thinking about when you're talking about how for that fire, the big thing that caused that change was the winds. And if I remember correctly, I was reading something about like the three things that cause the perfect storm for a fire, right? And it's like oxygen, fuel, and then some sort of like something that ignites it, right? Is that what it is? Those three pieces?
Yeah, the three factors to cause fire. Yeah, you got, so basically, I think firefighters and fire suppression professionals think of it as kind of a trifecta. If you remove any one of those pieces, you don't have the elements you need to start fire. You need a spark or some kind of ignition. So, heat could be it, but typically it's, historically in natural settings, it's been lightning or human caused fire. It can be a spark from your campfire. It can be fireworks. It can be, any number of things. But you need something to burn in order for that spark to actually take hold and grow. So you need a combustible fuel. And in the case of the East Troublesome Fire, it was about 10 years worth of built up beetle-kill pines and super dry vegetation throughout the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest. And it was something that, I'd grown up dealing with. I remember in the early 2000s as beetle-kill started to slowly march its way across the forest that I spent time in, and its trees went from green to gray, and there was so much standing dead timber. And then as I started to grow older and start hiking off trail and start hunting elk in that area, I'd have to step over all of that deadfall and see how dense the forests were. And then that was super dry, but then you need oxygen to really fuel that fire and help it take off. And then in addition to just providing that oxygen from the winds, those 100-mile-per-hour winds actually sent embers out in front of the fire. So it would take, burning canopy and sticks and twigs, pieces of trees that it could catch, and then blow them ahead of the fire's path and start those small spot fires like we were talking about. Those small spot fires turned out to be also massive fires. Colorado Public Radio has a really great map on this. You can watch just over how quickly the fires spread in the boundary if you just Google East Troublesome Fire. And then you can see this crazy island of fire out ahead of it where the spot fire was thrown up and over the Continental Divide and started careening down the mountains on the east side of Rocky Mountain National Park into Estes Park, which is, if most people are listening have ever visited Rocky Mountain National Park, it's probably been through the town of Estes Park. And so I actually texted a good friend. This was all happening during a workday at WRA. I was like slacking one of the old Western Lands team colleagues. We were watching it. We were pulling up all these GIS maps, which started my interest in GIS. And we're talking about how and where is this going? And then I realized it was like in a neighborhood where one of an old friend of mine lived. And I had to text him and be like, hey, if you're not ready yet, you got to get up and get out. And he later told me that was kind of the moment where he and his family realized they had to get moving, and then they shortly after evacuated his whole neighborhood and area. But yeah, those three factors are the same things that help a match ignite, or that on huge catastrophic scales, like really really dry tinder, a lot of flame, and huge high winds can push a fire like that.
Yeah, and then as far as you were saying about lightning being like the OG way for wildfires, I also read a fact about that climate change has now made it like the percentage of lightning fires and how often that happens has like risen exponentially since the early 2000s. I forget exactly what the stat is, but it's way more lightning fires now than ever before. But then, yeah, the main way really is people, right? That's like how it's mostly going down.
Yeah, stats vary state to state, and stats vary kind of by resources as well. But somewhere between 70 and 80% of fires in most states are started by human ignition. Lightning is still a very common means of ignition, but human ignitions are a rising and serious concern. And then, I think that's fascinating if climate change is driving more lightning. I've also, I can't remember the stat, right? So I'm hesitant to cite it, but I've also seen where climate change is increasing the speed and force of winds. It's unquestionably altering the weather patterns in the favor of continually growing and increasingly destructive, increasingly hot mega fires in the West.
Yeah, I'll look all this up and put it in the show notes. So we'll have some real data, guys.
Yeah, I can send you I'll send you some stuff for the show notes too. I've got that CPR article up. I'm like watching this fire boundary as we talk.
Yeah, there was a fire really close to my house one year, and it was caused by like chains dangling from a trailer. So somebody, they were just driving, they didn't have their stuff fully secure, and then that was it. Just took that little spark, got into the cheatgrass on the side of the highway, and suddenly, yeah, a ton of people were evacuated. So it's so important to really be mindful because you think that it's not going to be you and think about how awful you would feel. I always am like, oh God, please let me never start a wildfire by accident. I would be so mortified and feel terrible for the rest of my life.
I know. I always think about that with the East Troublesome Fire because I was hunting in that area, had backpacked in that area for my birthday. I'd gone on like a 2-day solo backpack, basically right where they think the fire started. And they've never, I think, been able to identify a confident cause, but they assume that it was started from human sources and most likely hunters in the area. So it always makes me think about that too, because I love a mid-morning cup of coffee when I'm out hanging out in the mountains and fire up a jet boil and have a cup of coffee and a little snack, and it's always in the back of my mind too now because I would feel horrible if I was the person who accidentally started something like that. But it really is it's a present concern. The more we get out into the mountains and the more we recreate, more potential there is for people to contribute to one of these disasters.
Yeah. So let's get into a bunch more kind of facts about wildfires and how they function and also how climate change is like contributing. I mean, we've gotten into it a little bit, but there's so many parts. And I feel like we actually need like 3 hours to talk about all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's okay. We can do multiple episodes one day. So naturally, wildfires are part of the ecosystem, right? And so a section of this issue is all of the mitigation that was done kind of leading up to where we are now, right? Because we were really anti any fires, which has caused like all of this brush and stuff, right? All this fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would point people, one of my favorite books, and I think a great resource on this is The Big Burn by Tim Egan, which goes over a huge fire season in Montana at the turn of the century, the start of the Forest Service, and kind of how the Forest Service, one, got into the business of fighting fires, and two, how we started what's called the 10 a.m. policy, which is the policy the Forest Service and other fire suppression professionals had and agencies had had for years, that any fire during fire season would be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And historically, like you said, absolutely, fires are an ecologically natural piece of Western, especially forested ecosystems. Some of our ecosystems have developed to be fire dependent. So, like lodgepole pines have what are called serotinous cones. They need fire in order to open up and spread seeds and propagate. And they depend on even larger fires than we might often think of, or can depend on some of those larger fires depending on the ecosystems. But small, low intensity fires have traditionally been a really integral part of healthy forests, developing forest diversity, helping thin out weaker plants, encourage regrowth, recycle nutrients, and help make what we call a patchy forest canopy, where you have a wide diversity of different plant ages, plant types, open grassy meadows with denser timber stands that are more resilient to these big fires when they come through. And one of the things that was a result of the change in our approach to wildfire as we expanded west and the Forest Service started managing, the forests the way that they have historically, was that by not allowing these smaller, lower intensity fires to occur and burn themselves out with regularity, we built up huge stocks of fuels, both large timbers and other fuels that have accumulated in forests for over 100 years. And as a part of that, we are now seeing widespread recognition that these fuel densities are unhealthy for our forests and that they're unhealthy for our wildfire resilient communities, that this is how we build up that intense fuel load we were talking about as one of those big three pieces to make not only fires, but mega fires. And in the East Troublesome Fire burn scar, we really saw that from, even though there was some more active logging in some of those areas. I had actually just hunted a logging clear cut in that area right before. There's a ton of other fuels that are left behind in that process. Companies don't always take all of that. And then so much of the standing timber in a lot of the West that's affected by beetle kill and drought isn't necessarily marketable. So we have huge fuel loads that haven't been able to be naturally recycled through these common ecological processes of wildfire. And then on top of that, there's historical record that shows that Indigenous communities have been setting intentional fires to help influence healthy forests for millennia at this point. For at least our record of the past 1,000 years, we have record of Indigenous communities using fire to help improve wildlife habitat and forage or influence fires. And so by removing a lot of the historic use of fire in our forests across the West, we've really built up these densely packed tinderboxes. And adding climate change to that mix means that the fuel loads are increasingly dry, increasingly combustible. It just takes the right mix of factors, a couple of things in place to really create these massive mega fires and send communities like mine in Grand Lake running out of town.
Yeah, it's such a bummer, right? Because our, kind of mismanagement of forest combined with climate change has made this really terrible, I don't even know, tinderbox of things like in our forest. So if only we could go back in time, but that's okay. We're going to do things now to make it better. And also, I read a really beautiful article about Indigenous wildfire crew. Like that now they're starting to incorporate more Indigenous firefighters and like practices. And it seems like a really great path forward. So I'll share that in the show notes too, because I was like really inspired by it. And the other thing that happens too, right, when you don't do these traditional burns is that then the traditional foods and plants needed for things like basket weaving and stuff like that don't have the space to grow either. So there's this other impact of like, we're then hurting like Indigenous communities kind of gathering practices, right? And the stuff that they need to like continue with how they live with the world. So yeah, I don't know. I was thinking about that piece too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's Indigenous fire practices are, I'm not an expert, so I won't speak to them to a huge degree, but I think a fascinating area that a lot of people are focusing on how to incorporate that into state and federally based forest management, how to encourage kind of the continued practice of that, but then also looking at that historically, like you said, these forest management practices have compounding impacts. It's not just that there's a bunch of stuff that can burn that's still out there in the forest that hasn't been or that should be removed in one way or another. There are really layers of impacts that compound on each other. So it is fire risk. It's on Indigenous practices and Indigenous species and ecological impacts as well. There's a lot of research on how dense forest stands, especially dense pine beetle stands, impede wildlife migration. It's really hard for anything to walk under 10 feet, 12 feet of stacked up deadfall in a forest. So there's certainly just so many layers to the impacts our historical forest management regimes have had to this point.
What about using prescribed burns now? I feel like people, just regular folks who might not know too much about it have a lot of different feels about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of different feels is a good way to put it.
Yeah, we just had a prescribed burn in the Dixie Valley. And the only reason I know about it is because it got smoky. And I was like, oh no, what's happening? And I'm in this like Eastern Sierra Facebook group, which is amazing. It's like run by a firefighter's wife. And she always updates it. And it's so cool. But she put in there, she's like, everyone don't freak out. It's just this prescribed burn and it's in the valley, which is cool because I camp there all the time. And I was like, good. Like, I'm glad they're doing that. But I know that in some cases, prescribed burns have led to bigger fires. But personally, I don't think that's a reason to not do them, right? It's just, it's complicated, right? It's really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Complicated, and that people have a lot of different feels, I think is a really good way to describe it in general. I personally agree with you, and I think WRA agrees with you that even though there is always some risk with fire is a wild element. There's always risk associated with using fire as a tool, that the science supports the increased use of prescribed fire as a tool to help replicate those smaller, more frequent, lower intensity fires that we saw naturally, reinstitute a natural fire regime, reduce fuel loads to help us build more wildfire resilient communities. It's interesting you talk about your experience because I think that's one of the things that we've seen in research as well, that there are communities that are more exposed to prescribed fire who are typically more open to its use, more comfortable with its use. So Central Oregon is kind of often held up as an example of communities that are really familiar with the benefits and consistent practice of the use of prescribed fire to help protect communities in that area from some of the massive fires that they also see. coming in and out of their areas across the country that are a little bit more familiar. And then, yes, I think a lot of people will remember last year in New Mexico, 2 escape prescribed burns contributed to the state's largest wildfire in history, which is actually 2 very large fires that burned into one, the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. I would say 2 things on that front, which is that 99+% prescribed burns that are conducted today are conducted safely. If you look at maps from the Forest Service, even just this spring in Colorado, there's so many prescribed fires that are going on that we don't know about, we're not talking about, because they're done and conducted in a safe manner by experts. There's always, like I said, a risk. I think there's a movement away from the term controlled burn, which a lot of people will sometimes use to prescribed burn, because it is a wild element. There's not a presumption of controlling fire as an element, but there's an intention going into a prescribed burn that you are controlling as many elements as you can and using that tool with safety precautions in place in a way that wouldn't be if you had an unmanaged ignition. So like somebody's campfire got out of control, right? The fires in New Mexico instituted a national review by the Forest Service of prescribed fire practices that have made the application of prescribed fire much more cautious and has created a new process out of that. I think many experts think is definitely a way to re-examine some of the historical oversights that might have contributed to the mistakes in New Mexico and the escapes in New Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense to me, right? Because we basically stopped nature from doing what it was doing, right, to support itself for 100 years. And now I feel like it's kind of our duty to help to reinstate this, process and do it in the safest way possible, right? Because nature is going to do it anyway with lightning, and just because that's what it does. But we have now created like more unsafe conditions for nature, right? So we have to be there to make sure that like this is going the right way, and that, yeah, I don't know. It just makes sense to me, right? I'm like, we have to show up and do these burns, and it's going to happen anyway. Like, do you want a mega fire to happen? Because that's what's, if we don't do the prescribed burns, fire's going to happen either way, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we often say, wildfire, and especially these uncontrollable catastrophic fires, these larger than natural fires that we are seeing increasingly, are something that, we have already talked about is a present threat for all of us. Prescribed fire allows you to choose when and where you want to fire, and to ignite that fire under the watchful eye of trained professionals with a plan in place, and ideally with resources. One of the things that we are working on at WRA is to help states and communities remove barriers so that they have the resources they need to train experts and to have all the funding and resources to conduct those fires under the safe and watchful eye of experts. One of the big benefits of prescribed fire is that it allows you to choose when and where you want fire on the landscape and who's there when it happens. Whereas a lightning ignition or a campfire that blows out of control is getting a head start on whoever your local wildfire professionals are who are going to respond to that. And it puts us behind the 8 ball from the beginning.
Yeah. What are some other things that are helping to mitigate wildfires?
I think one of the things that we work on at WRA, and I think that we think should be increasingly a consideration for communities across the country, is land use planning and thinking about how we grow in a wildfire smart way. From an individual perspective, I'd point out some great partners of ours at the Fire Adapted Learning Network, Fire Adapted Colorado and Fire Adapted Montana, for what you can do to help mitigate your personal wildfire risk in terms of hardening your home, shielding your gutters, covering your vents, things like that for when a fire is knocking on your door. But you ideally don't want a fire knocking on your door. You want to have your community decision makers plan ahead to think about how do we make it the most resilient area that we can against the threat of wildfire. How do we expand defensive space and create smart growth patterns that allow our wildland firefighters to get out ahead of fires and to fight wildfires in a safe way before they even come close to your door. So thinking about how communities are growing in the West, what areas we're developing in. We often talk about an area commonly referred to as the wildland urban interface, or WUI. We like to call them areas of high wildfire risk, because WUI is kind of, it's fun to say, but it also sounds a little ridiculous.
I love it though.
Yeah, but we tend to love to develop in really pretty areas, right? We like to be close to trees, and oftentimes that means putting ourselves in areas of really high fuel density That means expanding homes and communities into areas of high wildfire risk. But across the West, the ability to use those areas for community open space, to be more intentional in where we develop and how we develop in the wild and urban interface or in those areas of high wildfire risk is really still up to us. In Colorado, up to 80% of the area defined as the wild and urban interface is still undeveloped, according to a report by Headwaters Economics. So that means we are really at a point where we can choose as communities how and where it's best to develop, to grow, to increase housing that meets our needs to kind of still have these flourishing, robust communities people want to live in, but that also prevents you from wildfire impacts or makes you more resilient to wildfire impacts in the future. Open space is a great tool. Intentionally designed open space allows wildland firefighters to have a better area to engage fire with on what's called initial attack, when they're going directly onto a fire and trying to protect you and the community from it. It allows fires to hit areas that can be managed a little bit more effectively for that forest diversity we were talking about, where there's not so much stuff on the forest floor. The flames can decrease in intensity and burn at a little bit more natural rate that's easier to fight. And it also creates awesome places for people to go out and enjoy. We work with communities to try and combine all of those benefits into their community planning so that overall the community as a whole can be more resilient against a wildfire if and when it does come, even if they're in a more forested, more rural area of the West. I think that the intentional growth, intentional land use planning management strategies are a key tool to help people be more resilient to the threat of these wildfires.
Yeah, especially when you're thinking about, like with the Camp Fire, right? A huge part of why that was so bad was because there wasn't a lot of planning, right? As far as like, there's only one route in and out of that area. And I think about that a lot because where I'm located at the back of my valley, I have 2 roads that go in and out. And there's a lot of people back here, not a ton, but enough. And I'm always like, if a fire came from the back of the valley and we all had to get out, could we do it in time? That's like definitely on my mind all of the time.
Yeah. It's really interesting you bring up the campfire and also the one road thing, because in Grand Lake, that was a reality. I think they were extremely, what I thought was overly cautious in evacuating the whole community at the time, back before I knew what I know now, because there's really one road out of that community as well. And they were able to get everybody out in time. The campfire burned over paradise. I do have another show notes piece I've worked on with our colleague Jonathan Hayden about some of the land use planning elements that came out of that experience, because some people in that fire, if I remember correctly, took shelter in one of the community open spaces. And that experience has been shedding some light on the value of preserving some of these open spaces and open space buffers as a part of wildfire resilient land use planning. Because even in a massive community wildfire that had historic impact like that fire, these areas with water incorporated around them in a community park with a metal shielded picnic structure help some people survive that experience. But yeah, those wildfire resilient planning elements are even a piece in some of those places where previously the road and history infrastructure for evacuation may not have been quite as well thought out.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think about if the fire comes from the front of the valley where the roads lead, these 2 roads, that's it for us. Like there's nowhere to go. Well, I mean, we could just drive into the desert, that is my plan.
Yeah, and it's crucial to have a plan like that. And I think everybody across the West should be thinking about, what happens if I'm in this situation. We mentioned earlier that I might bring this up, but, when we talk about wildfire season, I think in Colorado, we can really, in many ways, do away with that concept. Certainly, there are times of the year where we might more typically think of high wildfire risk, but we had the Marshall Fire in 2021, which on New Year's Eve burned 1,000 acres of a subdivision, a suburban area that's really close to our organization headquarters in Boulder. So close that I texted John Goldebois, our CEO, just to say, "Hey, is everybody safe? What is going on right now?" And that happened in December, where we would typically never think of wildfire risk like that. And it was started in a grassland area on the foothills of Colorado and just took off with, again, really high winds and the right conditions. And we hadn't seen moisture at all that fall. It was an extremely historically dry period. And we've seen these fires come up in different times of the year. Again, I mentioned the East Troublesome Fire was in October. So I think it's something that everybody in communities around the West, like you were talking about, you've got a plan. If it comes to the front of the valley, if it comes on either side of those 2 roads, what you're going to do next. But I think that's something everybody should be thinking about, because the reality is, as our region aridifies, I don't know if we've talked about this a bunch over the years, but we talk about drought, and often people think, oh, are we in drought? Are we out of drought? But there's a great study from two experts, Brad Udall and Jonathan Overpeck, a couple years ago that showed our region is really just getting drier, what they call aridification, and we are becoming more and more dry than we have been historically, in an irreversible trend, kind of a change of state for us. And that means higher wildfire risk as we're in this transition as well. And so overall, no matter what time of year it is, no matter where you are, I think wildfires are a risk that people should be thinking about and planning for.
Yeah, aridification is real. And if you haven't listened to all of the water podcasts I just put out, I put out a bunch of them. Definitely check out the hydrology podcast I did with Crystal Tuli Cordova from the Navajo Nation. That's like a great place to start. Yeah, she's amazing.
Love some podcast plugs too.
Yeah, she's so good. So what can we do? There's a lot going on. We can do prescribed burns. We can be smart about our land use. But is there anything that we can do as individuals as far as protecting our homes, but also, making our forests more resilient, or making our between spaces more resilient, or anything like that we could take action on?
How do we make communities more resilient on a whole? How do we keep the wildfire in a controllable spot further away from our communities? And we think, like you mentioned, community smart land use planning decisions at this point are a way for us to really kind of control, and to the extent that we can, the wildfire risk that we have by protecting open space barriers around our communities that we can manage actively and help create healthier forest ecosystems in those areas. That helps expand our access to outdoor areas. But that takes community buy-in and community support. And sometimes those community wildfire resilience practices can change the way a forest looks. People might not always be a huge fan of some of those. So learning, investing a little bit in some of those strategies and understanding them and supporting them can make a big difference. Like you mentioned, community support for prescribed fire, familiarity with it, and understanding the bigger picture of why these little fires are being intentionally set by experts in order to help prevent the impacts of an uncontrolled catastrophic wildfire later is a major benefit for experts who are looking to help use that as a tool. The community buy-in is key, and working with your community to be focused on some of these community resilience strategies is a great action that you can take. But then on top of all this all takes funding, and that's a big part of what we do at Western Resource Advocates, is work on what we call conservation finance, getting the money to help people and experts, whether they're state agencies or local community agencies, or some of our community practitioners around the West who help both our local communities and our states accomplish these forest restoration goals. That takes money, and there's a lot of awesome money available in the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act, some of which dedicated a ton of money for fuel mitigation strategies of prescribed fire. But oftentimes that funding requires local communities to come up with what's called match. So most of the time, federal dollars aren't just given out without any strings attached. Sometimes you need to put up as much as 50% of what you get back, so what we call a one-to-one match, or you could have the requirement to provide 25% of what you're getting back in your own funds. And in Colorado, we've had success creating state grant programs that can help communities get that funding to match those federal dollars to make their projects even bigger and even more successful. But in New Mexico, I think we probably just had the biggest forest restoration success on conservation finance with Senate Bill 9, or what's called the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund, now that's been signed into law. You may have heard about this in previous podcasts with Brittany Fallon, my boss. That provides a ton of money for forest restoration health in New Mexico that has never been available in this way before. That money can be used to help leverage those federal dollars. So really, $1 on the state level can be multiplied by accessing some of those federal requirements. And that takes local political will and support as well. I think our listeners are great advocates for some of these conservation policy solutions, and they help us get stuff done across the West. And we've seen, regardless of what's happening at the federal level, if nothing moves through Congress, we're getting stuff done at the state level. And that comes in huge part because of people who understand the need for things like this in New Mexico, in Colorado, in their local communities.
Yeah, not to sound guilt trippy or anything, but you want to know at the end of the day that you did your part, right? that you did the best that you could for your community and your ecosystem and the nature and the place that you love. So I always think about that. But I'm a mom, so that's like how I think about everything.
Totally.
Like, I got to make sure I'm doing these things now for the future.
And this might be a cheesy plug for us as nonprofit professionals, but I really do believe in this. I have a lot of friends who care about these things. They talk about them all the time. They ask me about them, and they work in different areas. And they're like, well, what do I do? How can I get involved? And I don't necessarily have the time to do that. That's why we're here. That's why WRA exists, is because we are here to listen to those concerns and to put in the time to help ensure that communities and states are making smart decisions and enacting smart policies. And if you don't have the time to do so yourself, we are making it easy for you to take action, to write to your local representatives, to help figure out which local representatives are the right people to get to, and to help engage on the policy front. So you can know that we're working on it and getting after it, and supporting us helps us keep doing it. So, it's something that if you care about, but you're like, man, I can't show up to every city council meeting, or I'm not going to go listen and sit into the state legislature and testify. That's not something that's on the menu for you. It's something that we do and we can help make happen. So your support really makes a difference for people like us who are thinking about this day in, day out.
Yeah, we're literally advocates of the West. That's our job, is to go show up and say something, right? So we're out here. Thanks so much, Brendan, for being on the podcast and teaching us all the things about wildfires. That was really helpful. Also, I did look up some stats about lightning and climate change, and lightning strikes have increased 5-fold. And according to the Berkeley Atmospheric Science Center, in the next century, we will have 50% more lightning due to climate change if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which, that's wild. We're going to have a more lightning future, everybody. But don't fret. We're all out here working to reduce those emissions. I know you guys are doing your part too. Okay, so now is the time when we